Welcome. You guys they're here to come to learn a little bit about what's Vlad got to do with it. And if you're in the the whole Dracula scene, there is this constant argument back and forth between what did Bram Stoker know about Vlad the Impaler, and who was this guy Vlad the Impaler, and how did he get dragged into this whole vampire thing. And I've now been in Transylvania 12 times. Not all these photos are mine, because some can take them a lot better than I can. But it's a lovely country, and I like to go there to try to come on in if you're that's what you're here for. We're just getting started. There is some very interesting history associated with Vlad Dracula III, and I can now pinpoint to probably better than anybody else. Now we know exactly where Bram learned about Prince Dracula and turned him into account. So what we're going to talk about in the next hour is who he was and how he's connected to Bram's Count Dracula, and then the castles involved in this story. There's this wonderful dilemma about all the castles and the reigns and the battles that Vlad the Impaler fought in, and the castle that's become Dracula's castle. And then the real one, which I found with my son's help and another researcher's help and Bram's notes. And I'm going to reveal to you the location of Bram Stoker's fictional castle by the time we're out of here today. This is the tour company I work with. They are two sisters, Transylvanian sisters from the city of Sibiu, which is in the northern part of Romania. Gloria is the owner. She's married and lives in Sweden now, and Nora is married, but she lives in Sibiu herself. So this is the group. I like to have locals to take me around, because when you're in what really is partly a third world country and partly a first world country, you get into trouble and things, you want to have somebody local to help you out and show you all the really good stuff. And it's wonderful. The people in Romania really want to be a first world country. They want the world to know who their guy was, because in a funny way, they don't want to be known just for the country that brought you vampires. They've got all kinds of other things to be proud of. Like, they're the second largest amount of people working for Microsoft in the world, other than in Silicon Valley. And the second fastest internet in Europe, which is because all the rolls of wire are stuck up on telephone poles, they're not buried. So it's easy to have fast internet until somebody crashes in one of the poles and the pole comes down and you have nothing for a while. But wonderful place to go. Now, this is a commercial company that Gloria's company uses. Some of you just saw parts of it. I'm going to let this roll just to give you an overview of how beautiful this country is, and then I'll start talking again.
Do you know about this land? Beyond the mighty Carpathian Mountains, which Prince Charles considers his second home. It has been the outpost of Western culture and Christianity against medieval invaders for centuries, and these fortresses still stand tall. Prince Vlad Dracula inspired the name of the vampire count in Bram Stoker's novel. But the real history behind the myth still waits for you to uncover it. We want to show you an introduction to Transylvania, the hidden gem of Europe. This region is the central part of Romania, and our base camp will be at the Lul de Aur Hotel in Sebeș, right in the middle of Transylvania. It is half an hour drive from Sibiu International Airport by highway, and from here we can explore into any direction. To the north we have the Alba Iulia Citadel, which is only 15 minutes away from our hotel. It is one of Europe's latest and best preserved Vauban-style structures, and there's an incredible wine tasting cellar hidden below with an enormous collection of bottles from decades ago. Cluj is the capital of Transylvania with rich cultural heritage and big shopping malls. The amazing Torda salt mine will take your breath away, really something that you have to see with your own eyes. Sighișoara and Bierton are further north and northeast, with all the wonderful villages and fortified churches on the road. To the east, we have Sibiu village, a traditional Romanian village, followed by Sibiu, European capital of culture. Then Alboada resort with their specialties and delicious traditional food, made like in the old days. Nearby is the amazing Transfăgărașan Road, praised by Top Gear TV show as the most beautiful road in the world. Further east is Kurtz Monastery in Brașov city, boasting typical Transylvanian architecture. Next to Brașov is Bran, where you can visit the most notorious Dracula castle and make sure you pick the right souvenirs. To the south we have the Valley of the Beauty upstream of the Sebeș River and Transalpina Road, the highest road in Romania. Less than half an hour to the west, we have Arsenal Park Holiday Resort and Aqua Park. dazzling places for outdoor adventures and water resort. Followed by Corvin's Castle in Hunadora, where many Hollywood movies have been filmed lately. It's the real deal, although it looks like a fairy tale film set. Finally, there is also Sarmisegetusa Regia, an ancient megalithic site hidden in mystery for more than 2,000 years. Discover the beautiful landscape and wild nature as it used to be in Western Europe decades if not centuries ago. Touch plants and witness animals in their natural habitat as an ultimate adventure into the past. Find out about the traditional cuisine and taste the fine wine while getting to know the people and their heritage. Sebeș has its own points of interest such as the amazing Protestant cathedral, the City Museum or the Red Ravine, a unique natural preservation site, all nearby your favorite place to stay, Hotel Lul de Aur in Sebeș. Experience Transylvania and enjoy your stay.
All right, so you get an idea. This is, a pretty modern place. It is an interesting country, sort of a melting pot, really. And I'm going to show you some images in a moment of where it is located in Europe and why it's got sort of representation of cultures from Italy, as well as the Ottoman Empire, as well as the communist countries that were surrounding it at one time. Some of the things that need to be mentioned at the beginning of this, and I go into much more detail tomorrow. So this is just your little tidbit of what did my great-granduncle know about all of this stuff when he started writing the novel Dracula. He did a lot of personal research for 7 years for Dracula. We know that because he left his notes, and this is one of the pages right here. 124 pages of notes give me great insight into what Bram was looking at. He never visited Transylvania, never went further east in Europe than Italy, where he buried his father. But he'd been to Munich and to Paris, never went there. And it blows people away when you hear that because of his vivid descriptions of the country. But I'll tell you why he did that so well, and that's the London Library. And I go into detail tomorrow as well. I now know the exact books that he looked at and read, the Baedeker Guide, and he even defaced the books, which is sort of funny, and did some marking. So I know exactly what he was looking at. But they had descriptions of the different cultures, the ethnic costumes, and railway train schedules, all that stuff. Here's the 125 page of notes mentioned, and then one typescript. Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, purchased for just under $1 million the Dracula manuscript, which since it's typed, it's called a typescript. But we see what Bram took out of the typescript and what he put back in. The last thing in his hands before he gave it to the publisher to have it turned into the novel that is now 125 years old. What Bram did at the time that blew people away, and we're reading this book to this day, but you don't always get the perspective of when this story was written, what was going on, is he wrote this story in real time. It was published in 1897, but he said it in 1893. And he used real people, real places, real events that, in a corny way, made it feel real. And in its progression with Gothic literature, Frankenstein was 80 years earlier, but this one felt like it was at home, and it scared the heck out of folks. But we'll talk more about that one tomorrow. Let's get on to Vlad, because this is my mission. We distinguish between historical facts and historical fiction. This is Bran Castle on the left. This is a picture in one of the books in the London Library I just mentioned. That is the same castle, although it's called Tersburg back in when this book was written in the late 1800s by people who were traveling there and sketching it. It's one of only 2 sketches in any of the books Bram looked at that were castles. So, it's obvious to me that he had to look at something when he was describing it in writing. And that spot right there, just think of that. There is no castle there, but that's the location, and I got proof for that later. This is where the country sits. You look at Europe, and sadly with the war going on in Ukraine, it borders it. Moldavia is this disputed country that Russia feels they own, and Moldavia feels it's independent. And this is where, in the next couple of maps, you'll see a lot of the action in Dracula happens right up on here. So I put my visits to Transylvania sadly on hold until my friends over there say, Dacre, every trainload has all these poor refugees getting out. We're sending food over. We're kind of stressed. We don't want to start, leading tours again because, North American tourists will go over there and feel kind of bad when you see them stressed. Not that there's problems with bombs flying over, but the Moldavians have been scared that they're next on the list because this Black Sea is a huge strategic port for the Russians to get control of. Now, just think Dracula for a moment. Remember the Demeter, remember the voyage of the Demeter where the Count, this is where he went, all around here. And when he comes back, he came around this way too. So all this is in play as well as the rest of Romania. So this is what, when we talk Romania, we're basically talking three provinces: Transylvania, Wallachia, and Moldavia, as I just said. Wallachia is the province that Vlad the Impaler was from. He was a prince of Wallachia, as was his father. But Bram used, because you'll see why in a moment, he used Transylvania as the home base for this story. Castles and also the superstitions that he found, as well as the incredible mountains that you'll see in a moment. So most of the story, the Dracula story, takes place up here and then between the Black Sea and up here by train route. But just look for a moment at what was back in the medieval days. The Austrian Empire was very powerful, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottomans had actually crossed the Black Sea and taken over what is now Bulgaria. They were the Muslim power that was trying to take over Christian Europe. And they were hugely powerful. They had gunpowder, they had all kinds of things that these guys were just getting. And Poland was a huge power at the moment. So, surrounded by these battling empires was this little sort of podunk country that was being crossed over all the time by enemy forces. The only thing that really, two major things that saved them was that the Danube Delta, all here, the massive Danube River that flows through Europe, enters here. It's like the Florida Everglades. It's a wonderful sort of wildlife refuge, but it's so marshy. The other thing, and you'll see in another picture in a moment, the mountain range, all here, the Carpathians, you saw a little bit in that film. They're like the Alps. They're incredible. But the mountain passes helped Vlad Dracula and the guys before him and after him use guerrilla warfare tactics on an army of 400,000 that were coming in large scale. And little old Vlad did the best he could to put together, when he could, an army of maybe 40,000. As he forcefully gathered money and tortured people to make them fight for him to just defend this little country. And sometimes they were on the side of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and sometimes they were paying tribute to the Ottomans. They had to play back and forth. What are the sites associated with Vlad that are the prime sites? Obviously the ones I've chosen with experienced Transylvanian company to go visit. So these are the ones we're really talking about today. The old princely court, which is in Bucharest, and it wasn't just Vlad's, there was many rulers before him, but it's still there, it's being renovated a little bit, and it just happens to have a nice statue of Vlad in front of it. Snagoff Monastery and Komana Monastery is a very interesting battle between where good old Vlad is buried. We don't know for sure, but they both like to claim him because of tourist dollars, and we'll tell you stories about that in a moment. And then the Ponari Fortress really is the one fortress that Vlad is known to have been at and stayed at. And again, there'll be many more slides, 3 or 4 slides on each of these when we get them. Corvin Castle does look like a Hollywood set. He was imprisoned here for 7 years. Never fought from there. Targoviște is the second capital of the region other than Bucharest, because sometimes they were awful scared when the Ottomans were getting close. They moved their capital to Targoviște, which is the UNESCO site, and it's undergoing really good renovation. Wonderful place to visit. Brasov is a German city. Part of this country was run by the Germans for a while, some the Hungarians, some the Romans. So there was a lot of moving and shifting, and when the Germans are around, things like this, beautiful places get built, very orderly, lots of good trade, and then of course, what I call the disputed castle, the nexus point between Vlad the Impaler and Bram Stoker's Count Dracula. We'll get to that in a moment. And then there is no dispute, Sighișoara, wonderful walled city, again a Germanic city, a Saxon city, where Vlad was actually born, and we know that for a fact. So let's go visit some of those places. This is a map that one of the sisters drew up for me to kind of show an overlay of one of those real maps earlier, and the places when in Wallachia, where these dots are, where Vlad the Impaler had some sort of influence in his time. Either he was defending battles there, fighting battles there. And I have to say, at the seat of my pants, I was asked to come over to Romania, as I said, one of my 12 times, to give a discussion much like this in front of 500 journalists. They were trying to brand tourism in Romania, and I was there to talk vampires. There was music, there was arts, food, all kinds of other good representative people there. And I was the one asked to come over and talk vampires. And a long, long story, we could talk about it another time, about how communication goes wrong, about am I bringing a laptop with a stick, what, how long am I had no idea. Until, not kidding, 5 minutes before we walked over to sit down, all of us in this chairs here, and put these simultaneous translators on, that I wasn't going to be able to use any presentation whatsoever. It's all up here. And so I coined the phrase, responsible vampire tourism. Not like I'd been in a drugstore and in the, in the male condom region, but it was, you guys are doing a good job, but you're not telling the truth, and I couldn't say that. What they're doing is a lot like tour guides would do. George Washington slept here and here and here because they wanted to get people to stay at the B&B. And I'd been to a lot of these places, and they were getting the story all wrong. And it was like, hey, if you can get together on the story of where Vlad the Impaler was, where Count Dracula's, or Bram Stoker's Count Dracula was, you could double your income, and you could increase the confidence that North American, European travelers would have. Because quite honestly, there is a, even when I was going over there, the gypsy population, even within themselves, this is sort of where it's hard to pinpoint where the gypsies began in Europe. They traveled all over, and Ireland and here, but they're always, panhandling and ripping you off for something, and even the locals know that. And so they're like, oh yes, Dracula was here, come buy this for me, and come see my sister, and all this stuff. And it's like, you guys have to get away from that if you want people to take you seriously. If you want to get your history right, if you want to be known for something more than, just vampires, let's get, tourism, they can make a national course on getting the facts right. I know they do this where I live, near Charleston, South Carolina. You want to be a guide, you got to get the history right. And you got to pass the test. So this is what I was pushing in my 10 minutes off the cuff, and I got known over there for the guy who's teaching responsible vampire tourism. And it went over really quite well. And this is an offshoot of it. So these are some of the cool little things. Where did this whole idea of Order of the Dragon come from? Well, it was this fellow here, Emperor Sigismund, who was the guy that Luxembourg is now a little dot in Europe. It used to be a power center, and he was in charge and unified all these different leaders of Christianity to stop the influence of the Ottomans coming over. They wanted to come over and just take over Europe. So he started the Order of the Dragon, much like Crusaders, to donate some of your money and your warriors. We're going to start a wall, so to speak, a human wall, to stop this guy, the ultimate sultan, Ottoman sultan, from coming on over. Well, it just happened that Vlad the Impaler, we know, his father was one of these guys, Order of the Dragon. So he was one of these people representing Wallachia for Order of the Dragon, and he became, and that's not a real picture of him, but this is what they say in the house, bottom right-hand corner, where they lived. It was only one story back in the 1400s, but it's the footprint of where it is now, and they say, oh, there's a fresco we pulled off the wall. It's not true, but it's the only representation we have of his dad, and then his son. By the time he came around, and you'll see his career in a moment, they were getting better at doing modern presses and woodcuts, so we get a better idea of what he looked like. But the Voivode is another word for a prince or a ruler of Wallachia. His father, remember, the Order of the Dragon. What that meant in the day was either evil or devil. And languages have different plays on words. So when you say Order of the Devil, some people like the idea that they were evil because that would scare the heck out of the guys coming in. Oh, it's all the devils coming to get us. Versus Order of the Devil. So constant alliances back and forth. The Ottomans, this is how this poor little country had to play off each other. And if you've ever seen the movie Dracula Untold, it got a bad rap. Oh, it's not the way, nothing to do with the movie Dracula, Bram Stoker. It's a good movie, and somebody came up with a good storyline to look at what was the relationship between Vlad the Impaler and the Ottomans, the paying of the tribute. In real life, Vlad and his brother were actually given or taken by the Ottoman to stop Vlad's father from offering resistance whenever the Ottomans would come over to fight the Christians. So what better, right? Well, we'll take your kids. And well, we got your kids for 2 years, 3 years, so you're not going to bother us, right? Yeah, you're right. So that was one thing. Paying a tribute to them and all this was another. So this is the house that Vlad was born in, and then we get to know a little bit more about him himself. In 1442, he was actually, he was born in 31, in 42, for at least 2 years, him and his brother held hostage. They say, this is one of these vague history things, they say this is where he learned impalement. Who knows? They said that the Turks were doing it long before Vlad got famous for doing it. Who knows? Good story. Then when he got out, and then a few years later, 1448, he was so mad about what the Ottomans did to his father and his older brother, which was kill them in a torturous way. Buried them, up to their head, and then poked their eyes out, so they're lying there still alive, but with no eyesight, and horses running over them, all this terrible stuff. That he decided to try to fight back, but he didn't have the wherewithal to unite a country. He just, kind of flew off the handle, got a bunch of other guys together, maybe an army of, 5,000, and got defeated. So that first reign didn't last very long. His second reign, after a number of years, starting in 1456, he got his act together. He knew how to play politics. He got connected with John Hunyadi, which is the Austrian-Hungarian leader, much more powerful, and they all made treaties, and they then fought the Ottomans, and that's really the longest reign that he had. But as things happen in politics, even in this day, alliances shift, and some people didn't like the fact that they were enemies with the Ottomans, so they kind of shifted their alliance, and poor Vlad was stuck by himself again, and he got stuck in that beautiful Corvin castle. Hunyadi's, put him in there. Hunyadi said, the only way you can come out if you change your religion to Catholicism and marry my daughter, which Vlad finally did, gets out of prison, and then he goes and fights. In his final reign, he gets in power 3rd of November 1476, and there's this famous battle very near the Comana monastery that I showed you earlier, down closer to Bucharest in that marshland area, where nobody knows for sure, was Vlad assassinated by one of his own people, because it was like, he doesn't have a chance. He's just putting up resistance. Apparently his head was cut off. Head was brought back to Constantinople to show that Sultan you saw earlier. We finally rid of this guy. But during those years he was successful, there was a lot of this impalement going on, which is a crucial way to deal with prisoners of war. He also did it to his own folks. But some of the battles, that one near Togovšte, which I saw you the picture of, very successful battle for the Transylvanian or Romanian forces. Anybody in the battlefield that was either captured or injured, at the end of the day, the enemies normally retreat. Well, Vlad's guys went and found anybody that was still alive and took these big long stakes, 10 feet, 12 feet, sharpened it, oiled it, put it at the rectum of the just barely living, and lifted them like this, stuck them to the ground, and these guys would slowly die an excruciating death. And it was sort of oiled and not so sharp to puncture the innards and die quickly. You would be a horrible death. And so the next day, when the Ottoman forces would come for battle, they'd see all their friends, you're not dead yet, that sort of thing. And they'd stay up there for a while. Smelling, and birds are coming eating their innards. It's horrific. And so the Sultan was so put off with who would do something so horrifying, even your enemies, that he was, it sort of rocked him back for a while. So when he finally heard of his death, it was like, I want to be sure. I want his head. And so over the years, it was like, well, where is he buried? And anytime they find something that looks like a gravesite, which could have been him, oh, but there's a head with this one, that doesn't stand to reason. Or where is the head in Constantinople? Both of these monasteries like to claim it, and as I said, both of them have never shown anybody a gravesite. The one in Snagoff in 1972, there was so much going on in sort of the beginning of vampire tourism that the government at the time said, we're going to exhume this grave, let's just answer this question once and for all. And they did, and there was animal bones, but there was coins from that period there, but no human remains. And then you go there now, and then the priest will say, I can't show you where the grave is, it's in the back. We don't want the tourists to go and desecrate the grave. So they'll tell you it's here, but I can't show you where it is. The guys that come on up, yes, we can't tell you where it is either, because the tourists will desecrate. So they both get tourism to go there and visit. So his popularity obviously increased well after he was dead by these two paintings that are really quite famous. This is the famous night attack at Trboviste, which is actually featured in the movie, Dracula Untold. And this is probably one of the more famous kind of rules of intimidation that Vlad Dracula played. Here he is sitting on a throne. The Sultan sends some envoys to come over and get their tribute money and keep the peace. And he was trying to show his power and said, you're supposed to take your hat off in the presence of royalty here. We don't take our turbans off for anybody. Oh, you don't? Okay, we'll show you. And they got their armed guards to hammer the turbans partway into the head, not to kill them, but enough so that the nail is into the skull. So these guys would go back to the Sultan, and he would confirm the fact that this Vlad guy is not something to be messed with. So that's the famous, meeting of the envoys. This one over here, guys, is really interesting. It's a woodcut that was found in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia by two Boston College professors when they were trying to do some research into Dracula. And they went looking for this. Now, what this represents is one of the earliest forms of German propaganda you'll ever see. They invented the printing press. So they had the power of the paper and the word to send out. That was huge. That was like Facebook these days, what that does for elections. So this is Vlad Dracula sitting at his table, and what a horrible beast he was by impaling his enemies and chopping up bodies and eating them. So this went around different parts of the world by the Germans. And why the Germans so upset, even though they were welcome into Transylvania, except for they didn't want to pay the tax that was imposed on them for trading goods and services. The ruler before Vlad had said, come on in, we need to become, we need to have your trade. No taxes for you, a tax-free zone. Vlad comes in and says, we got to have an army. If we can't pay for a mercenary army, we're going to be overrun by these guys. Forget the deal that you said before. Taxes are back on again, guys. So the Germans didn't want to pay the tax, and anytime they didn't, impalement. So they got really upset, and they, a visiting monk took this information back to whoever was in power at the time in Saxony, and they created this famous woodcut. So you don't want to go down there. This guy's crazy. He's going to impale you for anything. And it actually became part of the song. And this is the court poets wrote songs or did poetry. And this whole slide is that. I'm going to tell you in a nutshell. Here's the two professors from Boston College, McNally and a Romanian guy, Florescu. Here is a colored version of that woodcut. And the Michael Beheim poem, he was the court poet for the court poet for Romanian Emperor Frederick. And he brought this thing back. And this is the famous kind of squabble that has now been put to rest. Because in that story, Beheim says, talking about Vlad, it was his pleasure and gave him courage to see human blood flow. And it was his custom to wash his hands in it as it was brought to the dinner table. Vlad washed his hands in the blood of his enemies, no mention of dipping bread in it. What these guys did, who are writing a book called In Search of Dracula, which is really good, either they got the interpretation wrong, or they interpreted it to their favor and said that he dipped his bread into the blood of his enemies and drank it, which would technically mean good old Vlad is a vampire before Bram Stoker has a chance to use his name. And people were incensed. Scholars went just ape shit over it, because that's an amazing discovery. Can we prove it? Well, Elizabeth Miller and others found people who really knew how to translate German from that period of time, and found that it was actually supposed to be that he washed his hands in the blood of his enemies. No record of drinking. So that research they did kind of took Vlad off the hook as a vampire. But nonetheless, when you analyze the story Dracula, you realize that it's his reputation and the history of it provided the candidate that Bram Stoker needed. Bram, in everything he wrote, not just Dracula, he was looking for good backstories that were convincing for his characters. There's no mention of the name Vlad in the novel, or Impaling. No mention of Wallachia. Bram changed it to Transylvania. And the book by a Scottish writer who lived in Sibiu at the time wrote this book called Land Beyond the Forest, and nailed it as far as really interesting superstitions that were happening in that part of the world. Strigoi, Nosferatu, vampires, werewolves, all the stuff that we think, where did that come from? Bingo, it's this lady right here. The stage plays starting in 1924. Bram died in 1912. He never saw his book turned into a play, but the stage play starting in 24 with Bela Lugosi, Raymond Huntley, completely changed the personification of that gnarly looking revenant from the grave into somebody like this, Bela Lugosi, that handsome Eastern European, debonair looking guy. That changed the image of Bram's story dramatically. Not to say it's bad, it just changed it. 700 movies later, with a Dracula character in it, many changes along the way, and we don't have to get into sparkling ones versus, runway models and all that stuff, but that's been changed. But what's interesting, in '92, the Francis Ford Coppola movie kind of brought it back a little bit, but they had the advantage of incredible costumes and a little bit of CGI, but nonetheless, I think that the look of that character in some of his roles was more to what Bram Stoker was doing. So what did Bram really know about? Where did he get his info from? First of all, there was a book in the Whitby, England, the library by William Wilkinson, and the London Library has one by James Samuelson. I'll show those tomorrow. But they specifically have info about who Vlad Dracula was, and the exact same stories that I just told you guys about the nailing the turbans in the head and the impaling, and Vlad Dracula being looked at as the devil. So I was telling you stuff that Bram knew, not just that I pulled out of books as well. With one addition, Arminius Vanbury is a very interesting guy. He was a professor, an expert in Austro and Hungarian Ottoman history. He's mentioned in Dracula twice. He was the source, that I'll show you in a minute, that I believe is the source of information about Vlad. And then these other books in the London Library that I'll go into much more detail tomorrow had these exact images in them. And when you read the book Dracula and you see the liter wagon, that's exactly the same wagon that the Count had his crate on when the band of heroes were chasing them back at the end of the story. A liter wagon is the type of Germanic wagon, has a long sort of tongue to it, and it works great on uneven ground like all over that part of the country. And then these are the costumes that you see, the Slovaks and everything else. Brand nailed it because the books were so good to tell them what to do. Now a little bit of a sort of visual as we go through. Remember, this is Trgovište. This is the second capital of Wallachia, near Bucharest, about 40 miles away. Look how flat the land is. This is the advantageous place here, and had huge walls around it in the day. But Vlad the Impaler built a tower, and it's one of the tourist attractions to this day. It's been rebuilt, but he built a tower called the Chindia Tower, or Sundown Tower. He always had a man go up top looking for visits by the Ottomans where they would be coming in with torches. And he made a rule at the time, a curfew that we call a curfew, that any light that would be seen was obviously the enemy, because nobody would want to go against the rules of Vlad the Impaler, because if you did, not just enemies, but he entailed did horrible things to people that were his own citizens that broke the law. So there's Chindia Tower. That's actually one of the churches within the place. What's cool about this building, and you can see this is obviously a new addition, but it goes down about 3 stories. It's not a wine cellar, it's where they lived. And I've been here when it's 100 degrees outside. I mean, you saw where this is, right on the Black Sea. It's super, super hot and dry, thank goodness. But it's like 20 degrees cooler deep down in there. And what's interesting in this place, you can't really see too much of the dome effect, but you can right here. There's a lot of it. When the Romans came into this country, back in about the year 500, and basically took it over, they also brought in their amazing ability of architecture. And they built those arches out of bricks. And that's why you saw all those pictures earlier, amazingly well-built and long-standing castles. It's because the Romans brought their engineering and their architecture to this country way back in the day. Romania, Rome, even though they were fought and twice they were sent back, they brought a lot of good things to this country that last to this day. Here's another picture, and there is the tower that I'm talking about, the Chindia Tower. Only problem for me about this one, I am a little claustrophobic. And there is a narrow stairway. And so when I go there, and that stairway goes up, you can see about 5 different levels to get to the top. I have to send one of my friends up first to get to the top, make sure there's nobody coming down. Because I get really heebie-jeebies when you get halfway up and you don't know if there's 4 people or 14 people, and you have to I don't like that so much. But I always send out my own scouts. Get up to the top, no problem. Massively cool statue of not only Vlad, but they got statue of all the rulers in front of Tagova State, because more people than just Vlad rule there. Now this is one of the coolest places. The mountains in this area are gorgeous, but they're also practically impenetrable. And the history of this, just read that while I'm talking, okay? Because then I can just rest my voice, take a sip, and give you the really good stuff. But read that. That's one of my friend's hands. I did one of those pano shots with my iPhone. So they've got volcanoes in this area. So somehow way back in the day when they built this in the 13th century, luckily, down below, there's a river, the Argus River. How many saw the 1992 Coppola film? Okay, this is where the story comes from, that Vlad was out fighting the Ottomans for the day. The wife is back in the fortress. She gets a message in an arrow sent through the window by the Ottomans saying, "We killed your husband. If you give up now, we'll kill you nicely, and that'll be good for you." She jumps out the window into the Argus River, commits suicide. Vlad is not killed. He comes back after a few days of good fighting, and he goes to see where his wife is, and Anthony Hopkins playing that role. He plays 2 roles in that film. For that one scene, he's the priest and says, "You can't possibly give your wife a proper burial. She can't be buried in a consecrated graveyard. She's committed a mortal sin." Well, of course, Vlad freaks out because he's been fighting for Christianity for so long that he stabs the cross. It bleeds blood and he drinks it. So he rebels against the cross. He then converts, as far as Jim Hart, the screenwriter for that movie, is concerned. That first 3 minutes is their version of how Vlad Dracula becomes a vampire. Dracula Untold is a 2-hour movie on how he becomes a vampire. Bram Stoker doesn't touch that much at all, with the exception of a reference to what he got from Emily Gerard, again the Scottish lady, who said he learned the dark arts at the Cholomonts, which is a school in the mountains near Lake Hermannstadt. It really is referenced in superstition. There really is a Lake Hermannstadt in the mountains near Sibiu, northern Transylvania. This place has been built with the mud from the Argus River, which is very clayey. And what Vlad did was march the people who did not, even the boyars, the rich ruling class, who wouldn't follow his rule, marched them another 40 miles from Tagova to this place and put all these guys to work rebuilding this place with mud and dirt from the Argus River that had this very clayish property to it that almost had a rubbery component to it. So when the bricks were put together in these massively thick walls, you'll see, well, you can see right here what they're like, and see what my next picture is like. Yeah, you got some drone footage here. That it stood quite well for 500 years of earthquakes and things because of that component of this rubbery sort of dirt and clay. The downside for tourists is it takes 1,480 steps to walk up. It's like crisscross all the way up through this forest. But it's nice, it's easy. You know, it's not easy, but we stop every 15 minutes. It's nice shade, a little drink, and it takes really about 45 minutes to slowly go up. It's tougher for me going down. As you get older, your knees, your hips going down. But they didn't have those steps in the days those people were building it. So the story is that Vlad worked them to death. Many people died making this thing. This is a very welcome sight when you get to the top of this, because now you see yourself up here. And drone footage of this, and then a picture of what it looked like from different angles. So it was impenetrable. That's the Oranges River right there, guys. That's how close it was. This is not the Ponari Fortress, but very nearby is Raznov Fortress. So there's a bunch of these around. The Germans built them for the wall in the city. Now this is an actual village. It's not just a fortress, it's a village that's fortified against the invading forces. And as I said, sometimes it was the Ottomans that were invading, sometimes the Austrian-Hungarians. But look how well preserved it is. They've obviously benefited from UNESCO money, and they're part of the UN, so they get money. But it's just so wonderful to go visit this stuff, and you don't have to walk up 1480 steps to get to Raznov. Sigishwara is really one of, to me, my favorite places. I've been there a number of times. Short story, but this is a bunch of Welsh actors that were over for an International Vampire Arts Festival that I was a guest speaker at, and they did a really fun play. And when it was over, on their way back, I bumped into them walking in. They were absolutely hammered, and it was like, "Come on, Dacre, you're the guy with Bram Stoker. You got to sing with us." And I'm going, geez, do I want to be like a real stuffed shirt and not? So it was okay. We were kind of singing their song and singing Dracula stuff. Luckily, it's not like we didn't get thrown in jail for public drunkenness. But what's neat about it is, you walk in this walled city, cobblestone streets, up lighting. It's fantastic. This is what it looked like. I mean, it's not just a museum piece. Back in the day, they all lived behind these incredible walls and moats. Here's the wall part of it. And look at all these towers. I'm going to give you a little bit of history about this. And I highly recommend when you get a chance to your computer, look at Saxon fortified churches in Transylvania. The Germans were really well organized about this. When they were there, they encouraged the guilds to donate money to build a tower in a section of the wall. The tower would have a holding tank for water, for wheat, for oats, for armaments, anything that they could rush into, hide behind the walls when there was an enemy force coming, to simply pass through. They weren't there to fight them and defeat them. It was, we're going to fight the Ottomans, we're going to fight the other side, and we need food, we need livestock, and we need women. And so they take what they could, and usually they just take the cattle that were left around and take all the fruit off the trees and all the crops. These guys would sustain themselves for a week, and then the enemies would be gone. So it created a really a communal style of living because of what they were faced with from the standpoint of battles. Now I'm taking this picture up top, from the top of that tower you just saw, and then we go downstairs at the bottom of the tower. Really is a neat place. They've got a torture chamber down below as well, which wasn't in action at the time, but it looks good. And that again, that's the building that Vlad the Impaler was apparently born in. But when I go there on my tours, I like to get up. That's about 6 o'clock in the morning before all the tourists come out. But tourists love the place. It's actually, they recognize it as a restaurant, the Casa Vlad Dracula, and they play it to the max as well. But again, more early mornings. This is the streets. There you see satellite dishes. It's a livable city, even though it's a 14th century stuff. And then of course the necessary Vlad Dracula souvenirs everywhere, from coffee to booze. They're not ashamed of it. They capitalize on it, and they're happy to tell you, most places, the real story. This is the edge of the town, one of those towers I point out, my favorite place to go and just hang out when it's downtime. That's one of those guild towers. I forget which one it was, metal workers, leather workers. But that's, it's still open, people can go walk in it. But that's the idea of how living was like back in the day. Now, one of the most special places is a village with that same attitude. We need to sustain ourselves during siege. And this street is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, mostly because a real go-getter, Caroline Ferdinand, has started the Mihail Eminescu Trust. Mihail Eminescu is one of the most famous musicians to ever come out of Romania. And they've got a trust that has put back in money into preserving the culture of this country. Now, this little village has attracted even Prince Charles. He owns this house. He owns a couple of them because he wanted to show people, and you saw that in the video at the very beginning, that we need to preserve this country and their way of life. And to do so, buy things up and rent them out or an Airbnb, which they do. Now look at the main road down here. Yeah, that looks like just muddy old crap. But all these houses are in pretty good shape, and a lot of them are lived in by regular folk. When the Berlin Wall fell, the Germans went back home. They didn't want communism, so they went back to Germany, and Romania was under communist rule up until 1989. So they left. Sadly, when they did, all these really cool villages that they preserved and kept were empty. So the Romani people, the locals, moved in, free housing, come on. And what this lady is doing is trying to teach them their culture. Look what you have. They used to be the people who would panhandle and rip you off for everything. Now they're selling little touristy things, and they're taking people so you don't have to get your feet muddy, taking them in their carts for when the bus stops. Nice thing is when the tourist buses come in, they don't let them into this part of town. You got to walk in, or the industrious Romanis have these little horses and carriages to bring you to see this museum. And the museum is part of this, the best preserved fortified church, not castle, fortified church in Romania, and it's one of my favorite places. And look how well the roofs are. The church is in great shape. They still have a service there. But this is what the opposing force would see when you came in to steal women and food and grain and so on. You were a sitting target. They'd shoot bows and arrows at you and so on. To this day, you can go up to these cool towers and see all this stuff. And again, here's that picture of the same idea. The guilds would be responsible for building a tower and a section of the wall, and when it was siege time, they were also expected to man it with their people to come and shoot bows and arrows at the guys trying to break in. We saw this picture earlier. I did a conference here once, and Nicolas Cage, apparently, Knight Rider or something like that, where he's all in some flaming thing. He filmed a movie here. So that's, and many more. It's absolutely gorgeous. And we're getting back to these two sites of the possible burial, and I just have to laugh because I can't speak Romanian, so I shouldn't make fun of it. But I came across this billboard with some of my friends when we were trying to search out, for my own knowledge, where is he buried? And when you see this poor translation in English, on this place will be lifted Vlad Tepes Memorial, near area where he was killed after fighting Bazar of Levata, 1476, and his tomb on First Monastery from Coman, his foundation. Obviously somebody maybe just did Google Translate and didn't get it just right, but we get the idea. They're proud of it. We went in and visited with the priest there, and they didn't tell them who I was, which is probably likely because they wanted to, they probably would have tried to extort money from me to give you information, but they didn't want to tell us where it was, because we didn't want to desecrate the graves. So we get to this nexus point of Brancaster, which I have spent many days there. I actually pimped myself out a little bit when Airbnb put on Night at Dracula's Castle. Because I try to say, yeah, it's Dracula's castle to a certain extent, but really, how much was Vlad there? They admit they really don't know. But it was on the border of Wallachia and Transylvania. So when he was the ruler of Wallachia, he wanted to make sure that the taxes were paid at the border crossing. And I'll show you that in just a sec. So yeah, they admit that maybe not. He ruled from there, but he could have spent a couple of nights there. And these are those two photos, guys. That's the one from the beginning of the slideshow. And this is the other sketch in one of the other books in the London Library. So I am a firm believer that my great-granduncle Bram looked at these two pictures, and they're mentioned in these books, the same place. These are all books that he had access to and looked at in the London Library, and I think he looked at these when he was describing the castle in the novel in chapter 2. Funnily enough, the first American edition of Dracula has what looks like a very similar image of this. That's 1899, 2 years after it came out. Here's some just cool, real pictures of that. I didn't take all of them. I did take this. This is a secret entrance. Queen Marie, the family that really owned it. You know, the Archduke Dominic, the Habsburg family owns it. They got it taken away from them during the communist reign, and then they got it back. You probably saw that they were trying to sell it. They decided not to sell it because now it's the #1 tourist attraction in the country, and they've had to pump a lot of money into it. This was an old hand-operated elevator for Queen Marie to get all her stuff up there. It's now, and I haven't been to it since they've created it, but it's an elevator ride that you go in, and as you slowly go up, they show movies and things as you go up inside it. So that's a cool attraction. Looking out this window that I'm in, this is the border right here. Okay, just before these buildings. That's the old Wallachia Transylvania border crossing that maybe Vlad was interested in collecting his taxes at. There is cool stuff inside. Some of it had nothing to do with Vlad, but people love it to be. This is lots of torture devices. Wasn't involved during Vlad's day, but since it was stripped by the communists and used as like a retreat for communist leaders, all the old furniture was gone. And the family is now bringing back exhibits, bringing back armor and stuff, so they can actually give people what they want to look at when they go see this stuff. So one of the cool things they had, which was state-of-the-art that never got stripped out, was actually this type of furnace with tiles. Think Italian tiles. This is another thing that the Romans taught the Romanians. So when they had these wood fires throughout the castle, there was this system of tiles that would go through and along the walls that would heat the place just by, like a radiator would radiate. There's that wall again. I'm looking, here's the manager of the place, and they actually have a room where they have stuff about Bram Stoker, and they have listened to me as I've helped them tell the story because they want to capitalize on all the movies that you can see, but I want to tell them, what was the real story, and they've adapted their message. All right, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes. I'm going to whip through some of the things associated with Bram. So Vlad, Dracula, let's put him to sleep, and let's bring back Count Dracula. Bram Castle, the exterior, already talked about. When Jonathan Harker comes into the country, he comes in a train, he goes to Areta. He then goes to Cluj or Klausenberg. He goes to Bistrica, stays at the Golden Crown Hotel, and then also spends the night in the Borgo Pass. And we're going to get to this place in a moment. And at the end of the story, Galati, which is this port down in the Black Sea, that's where the band of heroes arrive by train, and they think they're going to cut off Dracula in the boat. This is my map that my ladies from Transylvania did to show you. This is where the action is of Jonathan Harker. This is Mount Israel, which is where Castle Dracula is. The band of heroes takes their Orient Express to Bucharest and to Varna. They think Count Dracula is arriving here, and they have to chase him back up by train route and by river before he can get back into his castle and regain his strength. And so that's in a super nutshell, that's what the influence of the novel, the Dracula novel, has in the country. Nothing with Vlad. Here's the map, actually out of one of those books in the London Library, and I've isolated the actual part of the map, and that is exactly where the fictional Castle Dracula is. I'll show you in a sec. I took another map out of Bram's book, and I wrote on the copy of it. So this is where the train comes in. Oreta is over here. Klausenberg, just as I said. Harker spends the night in Bistrica, takes a carriage to here. And then, of course, look at that, Borgo Pass. Not a made-up name. That's something Bram saw on the map. And then this is where the Count Dracula meets Jonathan Harker in the carriage and takes him up to these mountains. And this is Mount Israel, which you'll see in a moment, is the exact place where Bram decided to set his castle. So what you've got is a big dose of Vlad Dracula III, a little bit of Henry Irving, playing the role of the devil, Mephistopheles in the play Faust, that Bram would have seen for 27 years as his manager, and that creates his version, Bram's version of Dracula that you see in front of you. Here's those two books I kept telling you about. This is the Wilkinson book in the Whitby Library that mentions Dracula meaning devil, and this is the page 170 in Samuelson's book that goes into all the detail right here that I was telling you earlier. This is the knowledge that we know Bram had. These are the two books that we know from the list of things he checked out, these two libraries. That's what he knows about these guys. Visually, this is a little bit what Oreda looks like. This is what Cluj and Klausenberg looks like today. And I have to just share a giggle with you. When I saw the Bank of Transylvania, you have to laugh a little bit. When we're standing there going, is it a blood bank? Is it a money bank? What's going on? I mean, here I am. I've never seen a Bank of Transylvania. And then in the hotel we stayed at, this is actually the footprint of the hotel where Jonathan Harker actually stayed. Of course, it's just a footprint. And then they served the meal to us because they knew me and my buddies were there on a fact-finding trip. This is like the same food that Jonathan Harker ate. This is polenta and, I don't know, forced meat. It's like eggplant and meat all mixed in. This is the Golden Krone Hotel in Bistritza where Harker stayed. Now it's a very modern place. This is the Hotel Castle Dracula. It is about 50 miles from the real Castle Dracula, but it is a cheesy-looking rendition. The Borgo Pass is a real thing, but my God, is it really cool. Way up in the mountains. And I just want to show you quickly where Galanti was before we wrap this up. This is a real port. Back in the day, it looked like this. This is a modern port in the Black Sea. And this is where, again, these are the Carpathian Mountains where the band of heroes come looking for Dracula. Turns out that he got off somewhere here in Varna and eluded them. And I told you I'd get to Vambury for a moment and just tell you why I know for sure Bram Stoker got some information from him, because this is the table seating chart that Bram wrote back in 1890. It sits in a museum, but it proves that Vambury was sitting at a table with Bram Stoker, Mrs. Carmichael, Henry Irving, Mrs. Stoker. Grusha is the secretary to Hungary, traveling with this guy, Edie Terry, Tom Stoker, Ellen Terry, the famous actress, Mr. McMichael with her visiting from Philadelphia, Mr. Loveday is the set designer from the Lyceum Theater, and Teddy Terry is Ellen's other kid. At that dinner party, I am sure, this is just before Bram went off to Whitby to start writing the novel, when he pulled that book by Wilkinson out of the bookshelves, I'm sure it's him that told him that. Why is that? I'm not going to read this to you because of time, but look at everything underlined here. This is from Dracula chapter 18. I have asked my friend Arminius. Is that a coincidence? No. He goes mentions Arminius twice, and he mentions who this Vivoid Dracula was, and he is the evil one, the devil. I say we get to Emily Gerard, and since we're winding down, again, read as much as you can here. This is the book, two-volume book that Bram had access to. There was a chapter in it called Transylvanian Superstitions that you see here. And all this stuff, this is the most important stuff that's summed up right here. Bram writes in Dracula, chapter 1, I have read that every known superstition in the world is gathered in the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some imaginary whirlpool. If so, my stay here may be very interesting. Well, we know it was quite interesting. Bram is referencing all the superstitions that he gathered in the horseshoe of the Carpathians, and she's responsible for most of it. A Scottish lady who lived there and wrote about it. She was actually a famous writer. She can just write more than one set wonder. And we're going to end with this, folks. This is some of Bram's own notes. Think of the maps that were in those books. And think of the lines of longitude and latitude you see scribbled here in these rivers and things that Bram wrote down. Well, I've written for them here so you can see them. It turns out it's a real place. It's a real place that my son and I had to go visit. It's right up here. It's that Mount Israel. And guess what? It's actually an extinct volcano. I'm sure when he wrote Dr. Seward's diary, this very place where Dracula has been undead for all these centuries is full of strangeness of the geologic and chemical world, the deep caverns and fissures that no one know whither. There have been volcanoes, some of which openings have sent out strange properties and gases that kill or make to vivify. We're like 1 minute, guys, okay? So this is what he's describing. This is what Bram found, and he gave us the coordinates to send us there. So of course, my son and I go there and I sign an agreement with the people that run the place that will help you make this famous as long as we do some good things. Like, let's recognize it properly with trails and a plaque. Here's me pointing at the site. And remember that picture I said earlier? Boom, we take the castle that's 400 miles away and pop it right there, because that's the intersection of these two places, an extinct volcano. There's the plaque. There's a close-up of the plaque. And if you ever do want to go, the food's pretty darn good in Romania. And the lodging is pretty nice too. It's not as Spartan as you might think. And you can sometimes get there in these buses that make you look like you're driving in a Count Dracula's carriage. So that's it. Sorry, you got pressed for time at the end. We've got better things to come. If you want to chat about any of this stuff, you can see me at my booth. We come and chat about any of this stuff. You can see me hanging out at the hotel bar a little bit later, or anytime tomorrow. And the one tomorrow is a little bit longer to go some more detail. But thank you guys for coming, and we hand it over to some very talented